This is the testimony of a Japanese civilian who witnessed American soldiers' unexpected acts of kindness toward Japanese children during the occupation period following World War II. Through the eyes of someone who lived through the devastation and then experienced this profound moment of humanity, we explore how small gestures of compassion transcended the boundaries of war and forever changed perceptions about former enemies. I still remember it as if it were yesterday. The war had destroyed everything around us, but suddenly something unexpected happened. American soldiers arrived in our small town outside Tokyo, and amid the smoke and silence broken by distant rumbling, they surprised us with a gesture I will never forget. It wasn't just food or shelter, it was humanity in its purest form. That moment changed how I saw former enemies forever. Before continuing, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we reveal real memories from World War II with respect and clarity. The autumn of 1945 brought more than just falling leaves to our devastated town. It brought the sound of boots, foreign boots, marching down streets that had once echoed with the laughter of children who now cowered behind their mothers' torn kimonos. I was 12 years old then, old enough to understand that we had lost the war, but too young to comprehend what that truly meant for people like us. Our house, like most others in the neighborhood, bore the scars of bombing raids. Windows were boarded up with whatever wood we could find, and the roof leaked in 3 different places. My mother had hung old blankets to catch the water, and the constant dripping had become the soundtrack of our defeated lives. Father had not returned from the Pacific, and we didn't know if he ever would. All we knew was hunger, fear, and the bitter taste of defeat that seemed to permeate everything we ate, breathed, or touched. The morning they arrived, I was helping my younger sister Yuki gather acorns near the edge of town. We had learned to make a bitter flour from them, and though it made our stomachs ache, it was better than the emptiness that had become our constant companion. Yuki was only 7, and she had forgotten what real food tasted like. Sometimes I would catch her staring at nothing, and I wondered if she was dreaming of the sweet rice cakes our grandmother used to make before the war consumed everything beautiful in our world. We heard them before we saw them. The rumble of vehicles, the organized cadence of marching feet, voices speaking in a language that had been forbidden to us for so long that it sounded almost alien. Yuki grabbed my hand, her small fingers trembling like autumn leaves about to fall. "Are they going to hurt us?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the approaching sounds. I wanted to tell her no, but the truth was, I didn't know what to expect from these foreign soldiers who had rained fire from the sky just months before. As we crouched behind a partially destroyed wall, I watched them enter our town. They were taller than I had expected, these American soldiers, with faces that looked nothing like the demons our teachers had described during the war. Some were young, barely older than my cousin, who had been conscripted 2 years ago and never came home. Others had lines around their eyes that spoke of too many battles, too much death, too many nights spent wondering if they would see another sunrise. What struck me most was their equipment, so much of it so clean, so abundant. Their uniforms were intact, their weapons gleaming, their vehicles running smoothly. It was a stark contrast to the last Japanese soldiers we had seen, retreating through our town with torn clothes, broken spirits, and eyes that had seen too much horror to ever fully heal. These Americans looked like they came from a world where factories still worked, where food was plentiful, where children still played in streets that weren't filled with rubble. The first group set up what appeared to be a command post in the ruins of our school. I remembered playing in that courtyard just 3 years ago, before the war effort demanded that even children like us spend our days making ammunition instead of learning poetry. Now foreign soldiers were spreading maps across tables where we once ate our meager lunches, planning whatever came next in our occupied homeland. But something was different about these soldiers. Unlike the harsh voices and rigid movements I had expected, there was something almost careful in how they moved through our broken streets. They didn't kick down doors or shout orders at the few civilians brave enough to peer out from their hiding places. Instead, they seemed to be looking around with something that almost resembled curiosity rather than conquest. That first night, as I lay on our thin futon listening to the unfamiliar sounds of an occupied town, generators humming, radios crackling, boots patrolling, I wondered what would happen to us now. Would we be imprisoned? Would they take what little food we had managed to hide? Would they separate families like we had heard happened in other places? The uncertainty was almost worse than the hunger, because at least with hunger, you knew what you were fighting against. The next morning brought an announcement that echoed through our hollow streets like thunder in an empty valley. An American voice, speaking broken Japanese through a loudspeaker, called for all civilians to gather in the town square at noon. My mother's face went pale when she heard it, and I saw her hands shake as she tried to smooth down Yuki's hair. "Whatever happens," she whispered to us, "stay close to me. Don't look directly at them. Don't speak unless spoken to." We weren't the only family gripped by terror that morning. As we made our way to the square, I saw neighbors I hadn't seen in weeks emerging from their hiding places like ghosts returning to the world of the living. Mrs. Tanaka, who had lost both her sons in the war, walked with her granddaughter clutched so tightly to her chest that the little girl could barely breathe. Old Mr. Watanabe, who had been too proud to admit his hunger before, now looked so frail that each step seemed to require enormous effort. The children were the most heartbreaking sight of all. They clung to their mother's tattered clothes, their eyes wide with a fear that no child should ever have to carry. Some were so malnourished that their heads seemed too large for their thin bodies, and many had developed a nervous habit of flinching at sudden sounds, a cruel inheritance from months of air raid sirens and exploding bombs. When we reached the square, American soldiers were already positioned around the perimeter. They stood at attention, their weapons visible but not raised, their faces unreadable behind their helmets. In the center of the square, several officers were setting up what looked like a small platform with tables covered by white cloths. The sight of those pristine white sheets in our world of gray dust and brown rubble was almost surreal. I counted maybe 60 civilians total, a fraction of what our town's population had been before the war. Entire families had simply vanished, some evacuated to relatives in the countryside, others lost to the bombing raids, and still others who had simply walked away one day and never returned. We stood in small, nervous clusters, parents pulling their children closer, whenever a soldier moved or spoke to a colleague. The commanding officer stepped forward, and I was surprised to see that he was younger than I had expected, maybe in his 30s, with kind eyes that seemed at odds with the authority his uniform represented. When he began to speak in his broken Japanese, his voice was not harsh or commanding, but almost gentle. "People of this town," he said, pausing frequently to find the right words, "we are here not as conquerors, but as helpers. The war is finished. No more fighting. No more bombs. You are safe now. Safe." The word hung in the air like incense in a temple, foreign and almost incomprehensible. How could we be safe when everything familiar had been destroyed? How could these foreign soldiers, who had been our enemies just months ago, now claim to offer the very thing their own bombers had taken from us? Yet something in the officer's voice, some quality I couldn't quite identify, made me want to believe him. He continued speaking, explaining that they would be providing food distributions, medical care, and assistance in rebuilding essential services. But his words seemed to bounce off the fear that surrounded us like morning fog. I could see it in the way mothers held their children, in the way old men kept their eyes fixed on the ground, in the way even the bravest among us seemed to shrink into themselves. Then something extraordinary happened. A small girl, probably no more than 4 years old, broke away from her mother's grip and wandered toward one of the soldiers standing guard. Her mother gasped and rushed forward, but the soldier, a young man with freckles and red hair, unlike any I had ever seen, slowly knelt down to the girl's level and smiled. He said something in English, his voice soft and musical, then reached into his pocket and pulled out something that made the entire square fall silent. It was a small wooden toy carved in the shape of a horse. The craftsmanship was simple but beautiful, and as he handed it to the little girl, his face lit up with the kind of joy I had almost forgotten existed in the world. The girl took the toy with wonder, turning it over in her small hands, as if it were made of precious gold rather than simple wood. That moment stretched forever, suspended between fear and hope, between the world we had known and whatever was coming next. The soldier's gentle gesture seemed to crack something open in the frozen silence of our gathered community. It was just a toy, just a small kindness, but in that grey world of destruction and defeat, it shone like a star appearing in the darkest night. I felt my mother's grip on my shoulder loosen slightly, and when I looked up at her face, I saw something I hadn't seen in months, the beginning of tears that weren't born from sadness or fear, but from something much more complex and harder to understand. What happened next challenged everything we had been taught about our enemies during the long years of war. As the little girl clutched her wooden horse, more soldiers began reaching into their pockets, and pulling out items that seemed to come from a completely different world than the one we inhabited. They weren't just supplies or rations, they were toys, candies, small treasures that spoke of a kind of abundance we had forgotten existed. I watched in amazement as a tall soldier with gentle eyes approached a group of children who were huddled behind their parents. He knelt down, moving slowly so as not to frighten them, and produced a small cloth bag from his jacket. When he opened it, the sweet smell that emerged was so foreign and wonderful that several children involuntarily stepped forward. Inside the bag were wrapped candies, their colorful paper coverings bright as flower petals in our monochrome world. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you're listening to this memory. It's important for us to know how far these words reach. The children stared at the candies as if they were looking at magic itself. Candy had disappeared from our lives so long ago that many of the younger ones had never tasted real sugar. During the war, we had tried to make sweets from whatever we could find, tree bark, grass, even sawdust mixed with water, but nothing could compare to the genuine sweetness that emanated from those small wrapped treasures. But it wasn't just the candy that amazed us. Another soldier, this one with dark hair and a mustache, was distributing small toys he had apparently carved himself during quiet moments. There were tiny wooden airplanes, carved animals, and even small dolls with simple painted faces. Each toy was unique, crafted with a care and attention that suggested these soldiers had been thinking about this moment for weeks, perhaps months. I found myself stepping closer, drawn by a curiosity stronger than my fear. One of the soldiers noticed me and smiled, then reached into his backpack and pulled out something that made my heart skip. It was a small leather ball, the kind we had used to play with in school before the war consumed all our games and replaced them with military drills. The leather was soft and well-maintained, and when he tossed it gently in my direction, I caught it automatically. The weight of that ball in my hands was extraordinary. It wasn't just the physical weight, though it felt substantial and real in a way that few things in our war-torn world did anymore. It was the weight of possibility, of a future where children might play games again, instead of searching for acorns to survive. As I held it, I realized that my hands were shaking, not from fear this time, but from an emotion I could barely recognize after so many months of darkness. Around me, other children were experiencing similar moments of wonder. Yuki, who had barely spoken above a whisper for months, actually giggled when a freckled soldier showed her a small kaleidoscope he had made from scraps of colored glass and metal. When she looked through it, her face lit up with the first genuine smile I had seen from her since father left for the war. The colors dancing in that simple tube seemed to remind her that beauty could still exist in the world. But perhaps the most remarkable thing was watching the soldiers themselves. These were young men who had traveled thousands of miles from home, who had fought in battles I couldn't imagine, who had seen friends die and had killed enemies in the name of victory. Yet here they were, kneeling in the dirt of a defeated town, taking time to make children smile. There was something in their faces as they distributed these gifts, a gentleness that war hadn't been able to destroy, a humanity that transcended the uniforms and weapons and all the machinery of conflict. I noticed that many of the soldiers seemed as moved by the children's reactions as we were by their gifts. When little Kenji, who had been mute since his house was bombed, finally spoke to say thank you in halting English, I saw tears in the eyes of the soldier who had given him a small wooden train. These foreign soldiers, who we had been taught were heartless demons, were crying because a Japanese child had found his voice again. The transformation in our small crowd was visible. Parents who had been clutching their children in fear were now loosening their grip, allowing their sons and daughters to approach these gentle giants who carried toys in their pockets instead of just weapons. Old people who had seemed ready to die from despair were standing a little straighter, watching their grandchildren play with gifts from former enemies. As the afternoon wore on, I began to understand that what we were witnessing wasn't just charity or military strategy. It was an act of faith, faith that human kindness could bridge any divide, that children's laughter could heal wounds that politics and warfare had torn open, that maybe, just maybe, the end of war could be the beginning of something better than what had come before. The remarkable thing about kindness is that it requires no translation. As more children overcame their initial fear and approached the soldiers, a new language began to emerge in our town square, one made of smiles, gestures, and the universal sound of laughter that had been absent from our streets for far too long. I watched a young soldier, who couldn't have been much older than my brother would be now, attempt to explain how to use a yo-yo to a group of fascinated children. His Japanese was almost non-existent, consisting mainly of good, yes, and very nice, but somehow he managed to demonstrate the toy's magic through pure enthusiasm and patience. When the string inevitably tangled, he would laugh good-naturedly and work to untangle it, never showing frustration or impatience. The children, emboldened by his gentle nature, began attempting English words they had picked up. "Thank you," they would say, their pronunciation awkward but sincere. "Very good," they would add, mimicking the soldier's accent. Some of the braver ones even attempted hello and friend, words that had been forbidden during the war, but now seemed to carry a new kind of power. But it was the chocolate that created the most profound moment of transformation. When Sergeant Morrison, I learned his name later, produced several bars of genuine American chocolate from his supplies, the reaction was unlike anything I had witnessed. The rich, dark aroma filled the air around us, and I saw adults as well as children involuntarily move closer, drawn by a scent that had become nothing more than a distant memory. He broke the chocolate into small pieces, carefully distributing them to ensure every child received a portion. I watched Yuki take her first taste, and the expression that crossed her face was one of pure wonder. Her eyes widened, then closed as she savored the sweetness, and when she opened them again they were filled with tears of joy. She looked up at the tall American soldier and said, in perfect English, that surprised everyone, including herself, "This is the most beautiful thing in the world." The soldier's reaction to her words was profound. He knelt down beside her and, in his broken Japanese, said, "You beautiful world." Then he gestured to all the children around us and added, "All beautiful world." His meaning was clear despite the language barrier. In his eyes, we were not the children of enemies, but simply children who deserved sweetness and joy. I noticed that some of the adults were struggling with emotions they hadn't felt in years. Mrs. Yamada, who had lost her husband in the Philippines, was openly weeping as she watched her son play with a small wooden truck an American corporal had carved. Mr. Sato, who had been so bitter about our defeat that he rarely spoke to anyone, was actually smiling as he watched his grandson attempt to communicate with a soldier using hand gestures and drawings in the dirt. The transformation wasn't limited to our side. I could see that these American soldiers were also being changed by the encounter. Many of them had probably expected to find hostile civilians, people who would resent their presence and view them as occupying forces. Instead, they found children who responded to kindness with the same universal joy that children everywhere possess. They found families desperate not for revenge, but for hope. One particularly moving moment occurred when little Taro, who had been born during the war and had never seen his father, approached a soldier with dark hair and kind eyes. Something about the man reminded him of the photographs his mother kept hidden away, and he tentatively reached up to touch the soldier's face. Instead of pulling away, the soldier gently lifted the boy up, and Taro nestled against his chest, as if he were seeking the father he had never known. The soldier's eyes filled with tears, and I heard him whisper something in English that sounded like a prayer. Later, I would learn that he had children of his own back in America, children he hadn't seen in over 2 years. In that moment, holding a Japanese child who needed a father's embrace, the boundaries between enemy and friend, between nations and peoples, seemed to dissolve entirely. As the afternoon progressed, I began to understand that what we were experiencing was more than just a distribution of gifts. It was a lesson in the possibility of reconciliation, a demonstration that even after the worst conflicts, human beings could choose to see each other as individuals rather than symbols of opposing sides. These soldiers had chosen to bring toys and chocolate instead of just supplies and orders. They had chosen to kneel down to children's level instead of towering over us. They had chosen to smile instead of remaining stern. The impact on our community was immediate and profound. For the first time in months, I heard genuine laughter echoing off the rubble-strewn walls of our destroyed buildings. For the first time since the surrender, I saw hope in my mother's eyes. For the first time since my father left for war, I began to believe that the world might hold possibilities I had never imagined. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting our damaged town in shades of gold that made even the rubble look beautiful, something extraordinary continued to unfold in our small square. The initial distribution of toys and chocolate had evolved into something much more profound, genuine human connections forming across the vast divide of language, culture, and recent warfare. I found myself in conversation with Private Johnson, a young man from a place called Kansas, who showed me photographs of wheat fields that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Through a combination of his broken Japanese, my schoolboy English, and lots of pointing and gesturing, he explained that his family grew grain that fed people all across America. The concept was almost impossible for me to grasp. Land so abundant that it could feed multitudes, farms so vast they disappeared beyond the sightline. In return, I tried to explain how we had lived before the war, when our small rice paddies had provided enough for our family, and we had celebrated each harvest with festivals that filled the streets with lanterns and music. He listened intently, his eyes serious and respectful, as if my words were carrying him to a world he had never imagined. When I finished, he nodded slowly and said, Same, we grow, you grow, feed family." His simple words somehow captured the fundamental similarity beneath all our differences. Nearby, I observed my mother engaged in what could only be described as a miracle. She was attempting to communicate with Corporal Martinez, a man with gentle eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. Through gestures and the few English words she had picked up from my father's old school books, she was showing him how to properly hold chopsticks. His efforts were clumsy and resulted in more laughter than successful food transport, but his willingness to learn and her patience in teaching created a moment of pure human connection. What struck me most was how the soldiers seemed genuinely interested in learning about us, not as conquered people to be managed, but as individuals with our own stories, traditions, and dreams. Sergeant Williams spent nearly an hour trying to understand the children's game of kendama, his large American hands struggling with the delicate coordination required. When he finally managed to catch the ball on the wooden cup, the children erupted in cheers and applause, and his face lit up with the kind of joy that transcends all boundaries. The chocolate and toys had served as icebreakers, but what was developing now went much deeper. Children who had been too frightened to speak were now eagerly showing soldiers how to fold origami cranes, their small hands guiding large foreign fingers through the intricate paper folds. The soldiers, many of whom had probably never seen such delicate artistry, treated each completed crane as if it were made of gold, carefully tucking them into their pockets like precious treasures. I noticed that some of the soldiers were sharing their own traditions with us. Private O'Brien, whose red hair and freckles fascinated the children, taught them a simple Irish folk song, its melody somehow perfectly suited to voices that had forgotten how to sing. Though none of us understood the words, we hummed along with the tune, and soon our square was filled with a hybrid music that belonged to no single culture but somehow felt universal. The most touching exchange I witnessed involved Mrs. Suzuki, an elderly woman who had lost her entire family in the bombing of Tokyo. She approached Sergeant Patterson, a man with silver at his temples and lines around his eyes that suggested he had seen his share of sorrow. Without speaking, she reached into her worn kimono and pulled out a small ceramic figure, a tiny Buddha that had somehow survived the destruction of her home. She placed it gently in his large hands and bowed deeply. He seemed to understand the magnitude of her gesture, that she was giving him something precious, something that represented survival and hope in the midst of unimaginable loss. With great care, he bowed in return, then removed a small silver cross from around his neck and offered it to her. The exchange required no words. Two people of different faiths, different nations, different experiences, recognizing the sacred in each other. As evening approached, I realized that what had begun as a simple distribution of supplies had become something much more significant. These American soldiers had given us more than toys and chocolate. They had given us back our humanity. For months we had been defined only by our defeat, our hunger, our fear. But in their eyes, reflected through their kindness, we saw ourselves again as people worthy of gentleness, as children capable of joy, as human beings deserving of dignity. The impact was transformative not just for us, but clearly for them as well. I could see it in how they stood a little taller, how their smiles came a little easier, how they looked at each other with something that might have been pride. They had discovered that victory could be more than conquest, that strength could be expressed through kindness, that true leadership sometimes meant kneeling down to a child's level and offering a piece of chocolate. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I understood that this day would be divided into before and after, just as our lives had been divided by the war itself. But this division was different. This one offered hope. The chocolate lingered on our tongues long after the last piece had been savored, but its sweetness was more than physical. It carried with it the taste of possibilities we had almost forgotten could exist. As evening settled over our town like a gentle blanket, the American soldiers began preparing to return to their camp, but the day's magic seemed reluctant to end. If this memory has already moved you, leave a like. It helps the story reach more people. Private Henderson, a young man with kind eyes and a slow, gentle way of speaking, had spent the afternoon teaching origami to a group of children. Now, as he prepared to leave, each child pressed a paper crane into his hands. His pockets bulged with the delicate creations, and I could see him taking great care not to crush a single one. When little Masako handed him her crane, made from a page torn from her last remaining storybook, he looked at her with such reverence that you would have thought she had given him a diamond. "Tomorrow," he said in careful, practiced Japanese. "Tomorrow. More?" His question hung in the air like incense, carrying with it promises that seemed too good to be true. Tomorrow had become a word we had stopped using during the war, when each day was simply about survival, and planning beyond nightfall seemed like dangerous optimism. Captain Roberts, the commanding officer who had first addressed us that morning, approached my mother with a respect that still amazed me. Through a translator, a Japanese-American soldier named Private Nakamura, who had become our bridge between worlds, he explained that the soldiers would return the next day with medical supplies and personnel. They wanted to ensure that everyone in the town, especially the children, received proper medical attention. The concept was revolutionary. During the war, medical care had been reserved for soldiers and essential workers. Civilians, particularly children, had learned to endure illnesses and injuries without hope of professional treatment. The idea that foreign soldiers, former enemies, would provide medical care for Japanese children seemed to defy everything we thought we knew about the nature of war and occupation. But more surprising than the promise of medical care was what happened next. Several of the soldiers began producing items from their personal belongings, not official supplies, but things that belonged to them personally. Sergeant Collins pulled out a harmonica and played a gentle melody that seemed to capture the melancholy beauty of our devastated landscape. The music floated over our small gathering like a prayer, and I saw tears in the eyes of adults who had forgotten that beauty could still exist in the world. Corporal Davis shared photographs of his family, his wife, his 2 young daughters, his parents standing in front of a white house with a green lawn that seemed to stretch forever. As he showed these pictures to our children, explaining in simple words who each person was, I realized he was doing something profound. He was making himself human to us, showing us that he too was someone's son, someone's husband, someone's father. The enemy was disappearing, replaced by individual people with individual stories. The children responded by sharing their own treasures. Hiroshi, who rarely spoke to anyone, brought out a small notebook where he had been drawing pictures throughout the war. Sketches of his father, his destroyed school, the birds that still somehow found reasons to sing among the ruins. As he showed these drawings to the soldiers, I watched their faces change. They were seeing the war through a child's eyes, understanding perhaps for the first time the human cost of all that destruction. What moved me most was watching Yuki with Sergeant Thompson, a tall, gentle man who had lost his own son in the fighting in Europe. She had approached him shyly, drawn by his quiet sadness that somehow matched her own. Without words, she took his large hand in her small one and led him to a partially destroyed garden where a single flower had somehow managed to bloom among the debris. They sat together in companionable silence, this American soldier and this Japanese child, both mourning losses too profound for words. He showed her a photograph of his son, a boy about my age with a bright smile and eyes full of mischief. She pointed to the flower and then to the photograph, and somehow in that simple gesture, she managed to communicate something about beauty surviving in the midst of loss, about hope growing in the most unlikely places. As the soldiers finally prepared to leave, the atmosphere in our square had transformed completely from the fearful gathering of that morning. Children who had hidden behind their mothers were now tugging at olive green sleeves, asking in broken English when the soldiers would return. Parents who had clutched their little ones in terror were now bowing respectfully as these gentle giants prepared to depart. Private Martinez approached me with something in his hands, a small notebook and a pencil. Through gestures and his limited Japanese, he indicated that I should write down my thoughts, my experiences, the things I was feeling. "Important," he said, tapping the notebook. "Remember to important." At the time, I thought he simply wanted me to practice writing, but years later I would understand that he was encouraging me to document this moment of transformation, to preserve the memory of when enemies became friends. The farewell rituals that emerged were spontaneous and beautiful. Children lined up to shake hands with each soldier, many attempting English phrases they had learned that afternoon. "Thank you, American friend," became the most common, though the pronunciation varied wildly. The soldiers in turn attempted Japanese courtesies, their bows awkward but sincere, their sayonara carefully pronounced with the solemnity of a sacred word. But perhaps the most moving moment came when Mrs. Watanabe, the oldest person in our group, approached Captain Roberts. She had said nothing all day, simply observing with the careful attention of someone who had lived through many changes and learned to be cautious about trusting new developments. Now, as the day ended, she walked slowly to the captain and, in a voice clear enough for everyone to hear, spoke in English that surprised us all. "My son," she said, her accent thick but her words unmistakable. "My son die in Philippines. Fight your soldiers. I think hate all Americans forever." She paused, looking directly into the captain's eyes. "Today you give chocolate to children, you bring toys, you make children laugh. My hate. Very tired now. Maybe time to rest." The captain's response was immediate and profound. He removed his hat and bowed deeply, holding the position for several long seconds. When he straightened, his eyes were bright with tears. "Mom," he said, and Private Nakamura translated his words, "Your son was brave. All our sons were brave. Now we try to make a world where no more mothers lose sons." As the soldiers walked away, their boots creating a rhythm on the broken pavement, they left behind more than just the memory of chocolate and toys. They had given us a glimpse of what peace might actually look like, not just the absence of war, but the presence of understanding, of kindness, of the possibility that former enemies could become friends. That night, as I lay on my thin futon listening to Yuki whisper excitedly about the kaleidoscope and the chocolate, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in our world. The fear that had consumed us for so long had been replaced by something I could barely name, hope perhaps, or maybe just the simple recognition that tomorrow might hold surprises that weren't necessarily terrible. The notebook Private Martinez had given me lay beside my pillow, and in the dim light, I began to write. Not about the war, not about the bombing or the hunger or the fear, but about the soldier who had carved toys in his spare time, about the chocolate that tasted like dreams, about the way children's laughter could make even grown men cry with joy. I wrote about the possibility that the world might be larger and more generous than we had been taught to believe. The next morning brought with it an anticipation unlike anything we had experienced since before the war. Children woke early, not from hunger or fear, but from excitement. They gathered in small groups, chattering about the previous day's events, showing each other their treasures, the wooden toys, the origami the soldiers had attempted, the precious wrapper from a piece of chocolate that several children had decided to keep forever. I found myself checking the road that led to the American camp more frequently than I cared to admit. Private Henderson had said tomorrow, and like every child in our town, I had taken that promise and held it close to my heart like a sacred thing. The adults tried to maintain their composure, but I could see them glancing toward the road as well, their faces carrying expressions I hadn't seen since before the war, the look of people who were allowing themselves to hope. When the convoy of American vehicles finally appeared, a cheer went up from the children that could probably be heard for miles. But this time, we weren't hiding behind walls or clutching our parents in fear. This time, we ran toward them like they were long-lost relatives returning home. The transformation in our response was so complete that even I was amazed by it. The soldiers emerged from their vehicles with smiles already on their faces, clearly as happy to see us as we were to see them. But today they brought more than toys and chocolate. They brought medical personnel, supplies, and something even more valuable, the clear intention to help us rebuild not just our bodies, but our faith in the possibility of human goodness. Dr. Peterson, our army medic with gentle hands and infinite patience, set up a makeshift clinic in what remained of our community center. He began examining children who hadn't seen a doctor in years, treating infections, checking for malnutrition, providing medications that many families couldn't have afforded even before the war. But more than the medical care, it was his manner that amazed us, the way he spoke to each child as if they were precious, the way he took time to explain what he was doing, the way he made even the most frightened little ones smile. Meanwhile, other soldiers were working with the adults, assessing what resources we needed most desperately. Captain Roberts, through Private Nakamura's translation, explained that they had authorization to provide not just emergency supplies, but assistance in rebuilding essential infrastructure. They wanted to help us restore our water system, repair damage to critical buildings, and establish a small school where children could begin learning again. The concept of learning seemed almost foreign after so many months when survival had been our only curriculum. But Corporal Adams, who had been a teacher in civilian life, began gathering the children around him and pulling out books, real books with intact pages and colorful illustrations. When he opened the first one and began reading in English, then waited for Private Nakamura to translate, the children listened with the kind of attention usually reserved for sacred ceremonies. The story was simple, a tale about a little bird who was afraid to fly but discovered that courage was something that grew stronger with practice. As the translation unfolded, I could see the children connecting with the bird's journey, understanding that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to try despite being afraid. When the story ended, several children immediately began asking if they could learn to read English themselves. But it was the interaction between Sergeant Collins and my mother that perhaps best exemplified the day's deeper meaning. He had brought a small sewing kit and some fabric, and through gestures and broken language, offered to help her repair some of our clothes that had been torn during the bombings. What followed was a lesson in the universal nature of practical care. My mother showed him how Japanese clothing was constructed, the specific stitching techniques that made kimonos both beautiful and durable. He, in turn, demonstrated American sewing methods, ways of reinforcing tiers that would make garments last longer. They worked side by side, two people from vastly different worlds, sharing knowledge that transcended nationality and recent enmity. As I watched them work together, I realized I was witnessing something historically significant. These weren't just random acts of kindness. They were the seeds of a new kind of relationship between our peoples. The soldiers weren't trying to impose their culture on us or make us forget our own traditions. Instead, they were showing us that different approaches to the same human needs could coexist and even strengthen each other. The medical examinations revealed what we all knew but had learned not to discuss, that malnutrition was widespread, that many children were suffering from preventable diseases, that the war had taken a toll on our community that went far beyond destroyed buildings. But instead of treating these discoveries as shameful secrets, Dr. Peterson approached each issue with a matter-of-fact compassion that somehow made our suffering feel valid rather than embarrassing. When he discovered that little Kenji had a severe ear infection that had been left untreated for months, he didn't lecture about medical neglect. Instead, he simply began treatment while explaining to Kenji's mother how to recognize similar symptoms in the future. When he found that several children showed signs of vitamin deficiency, he provided supplements while teaching families about nutrition using foods that were actually available to us. By the end of that second day, something had fundamentally changed in our town's relationship with these American soldiers. They were no longer foreign occupiers who happened to be kind. They had become partners in the project of rebuilding our community's future. The children had begun using English words naturally in their play. The adults were asking questions about American customs and sharing information about Japanese traditions, and everyone was beginning to imagine a tomorrow that included continued friendship with these gentle giants who had chocolate in their pockets and healing in their hands. The third day brought with it a surprise that none of us had anticipated. As the familiar convoy of American vehicles approached our town, we noticed something different: construction equipment, building supplies, and a team of military engineers who looked like they had come prepared for serious work. Captain Roberts gathered us together and, through Private Nakamura, announced that they had received approval to help us rebuild our school. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. For months, education had seemed like a luxury we could no longer afford. Our school had been badly damaged in the bombing, and with so many families struggling simply to find food, the idea of children returning to regular lessons had felt like an impossible dream. Yet here were these American soldiers, proposing to use their time, materials, and expertise to restore something that was precious to our community, but seemingly valueless to an occupying force. What followed over the next several days was unlike anything I had ever witnessed. American soldiers worked side by side with Japanese civilians, sharing tools, exchanging techniques, and slowly transforming the bombed-out shell of our school into something that looked like hope taking physical form. The language barriers that had seemed so insurmountable just days before began to dissolve as people found ways to communicate through the universal language of shared work. I watched Sergeant Morrison, the man who had first distributed chocolate to our children, teaching my neighbor, Mr. Tanaka, how to use an American power saw. The lesson required no words, just careful demonstration, patient guidance, and the mutual respect of two craftsmen sharing their knowledge. When Mr. Tanaka successfully completed his first cut, Sergeant Morrison's grin was so wide it seemed to light up the entire construction site. Meanwhile, the Japanese workers were teaching the Americans about local building techniques that had been developed over centuries to withstand earthquakes and harsh weather. Mrs. Suzuki, despite her advanced age, demonstrated traditional joinery methods that fascinated the American engineers. They took notes, asked questions through translators, and incorporated Japanese techniques into their construction plans with a respect that spoke of genuine professional admiration. The children, not to be left out of this great project, organized themselves into helpful crews. We carried tools, swept debris, and provided water to the workers. But more importantly, we served as living bridges between the two groups of adults, easily switching between Japanese and the English words we were learning, translating not just language, but cultural nuances that helped prevent misunderstandings. Yuki, who had been so quiet and fearful just days before, appointed herself as the official welcome committee for new soldiers. Each morning, she would station herself at the school entrance with a bow and a carefully practiced English greeting. "Good morning, American friends. Thank you for building our school." Her formality and sincerity never failed to melt the hearts of even the most serious military personnel. The work progressed with remarkable speed, but it wasn't just the efficiency that impressed us. It was the care that went into every detail. The soldiers didn't just rebuild walls, they created improvements that showed they had thought deeply about how children would use the space. They installed better lighting, improved ventilation, and even created a small library corner using books they had requested from their own supplies. Lieutenant Parker, who had been an architect in civilian life, worked with our former principal to design classrooms that incorporated both American educational concepts and traditional Japanese learning methods. They created spaces that were flexible enough to accommodate different teaching styles, with areas for group work, individual study, and the formal instruction that was central to Japanese educational tradition. But perhaps the most touching aspect of the reconstruction was how it brought together people who had lost so much during the war. Mr. Yamamoto, who had lost his eldest son in the Pacific, worked closely with Corporal Stevens, whose brother had died fighting Japanese forces in the Philippines. Instead of dwelling on their mutual losses, they found common ground in their shared commitment to building something positive for the children who would inherit the post-war world. I overheard them talking one afternoon as they installed new windows. Through Private Nakamura's translation, Mr. Yamamoto explained that he wanted the school to be beautiful because children deserved to learn in spaces that inspired them to dream. Corporal Stevens nodded and replied that his brother would have wanted the same thing, for all children, regardless of nationality, to have the chance to build a better future than the one their generation had experienced. The completion of the school's reconstruction became a community celebration that transcended every boundary we had previously recognized. American soldiers and Japanese families worked together to clean and prepare the classrooms, to arrange desks and chairs, to hang educational posters in both English and Japanese. The school that emerged from this collaboration was more than just a rebuilt building. It was a symbol of what became possible when people chose cooperation over conflict. On the day before the school's official reopening, Captain Roberts made an announcement that surprised everyone. The American military had decided to provide ongoing educational support, including English language instruction, science equipment, and regular visits from military personnel who could serve as cultural ambassadors. They were committing not just to rebuilding our school, but to helping create an educational experience that would prepare our children for a world where Japanese and Americans would need to work together. That evening, as I looked at our beautiful new school illuminated by electric lights that actually worked, I realized that what we had built was more than just a place for learning. We had constructed a bridge between two peoples, a foundation for friendship that could support the weight of a shared future. The American soldiers had given us more than chocolate and toys. They had given us the tools to rebuild our dreams. Years have passed since that remarkable autumn when American soldiers brought chocolate and toys to the children of our defeated town, but the memory remains as vivid as if it happened yesterday. As I write these words, I am no longer the frightened 12-year-old boy who hid behind broken walls, but a man whose life was forever changed by witnessing what became possible when enemies chose to see each other as human beings. The school that we rebuilt together became the foundation for everything that followed. Children who learned English from Sergeant Collins went on to become translators, diplomats, and business leaders who helped forge the post-war relationship between Japan and America. Students who played with toys carved by American soldiers grew up to become teachers themselves, passing on not just academic knowledge but the deeper lesson that understanding between peoples was always possible if both sides were willing to extend their hands in friendship. Yuki, my little sister who had been so frightened that first day, eventually became a nurse who specialized in treating American military personnel stationed in Japan. She never forgot the kindness shown to her by those soldiers, and she spent her career returning that kindness to other young men who were far from home and in need of gentle care. The kaleidoscope that soldier had made for her sat on her desk throughout her career, a reminder that beauty could be created from broken pieces if someone cared enough to arrange them properly. Private Nakamura, the Japanese-American translator who had served as our bridge between languages and cultures, remained in Japan after his military service ended. He established a school for international understanding, where Japanese and American children learned together, grew up together, and formed friendships that would last their entire lives. His vision was simple but profound. If children could learn to see each other as friends rather than potential enemies, perhaps the next generation would find ways to resolve conflicts without resorting to war. The impact of those days extended far beyond our small town. The photographs that military photographers took of American soldiers sharing chocolate with Japanese children were published in newspapers around the world, helping to shape public opinion about what post-war occupation could look like. Instead of images of conquest and subjugation, people saw pictures of kindness, hope, and the possibility of reconciliation. Captain Roberts, who had first announced that we were safe, went on to become a leader in veteran affairs, advocating for programs that helped soldiers transition from combat roles to peacekeeping and reconstruction work. He often spoke about how the experience of rebuilding our school had changed his understanding of what military service could accomplish. We discovered, he would say in his speeches, that construction could be more powerful than destruction, that building schools left a more lasting impact than winning battles. The chocolate that had tasted so miraculous to children who had forgotten sweetness became a symbol that transcended its simple ingredients. American companies began including chocolate in care packages sent to post-war reconstruction efforts around the world, understanding that sometimes the smallest gestures could create the biggest changes in people's hearts. The phrase chocolate diplomacy entered political vocabulary, describing the power of personal kindness to achieve what formal negotiations sometimes could not. But perhaps the most important legacy was the lesson that ordinary people, soldiers following orders, civilians trying to survive, children afraid of strangers, could choose in any moment to create something beautiful together. The decision to bring toys and chocolate instead of just supplies and orders was made by individual soldiers who understood that their actions would be remembered long after military objectives were forgotten. Subscribe to our channel to not miss the next real narratives from World War II. Thank you for following this memory of courage and humanity. We'll see you in the next video. As I finish writing this account, I can still taste that chocolate, still feel the weight of that leather ball in my hands, still hear the sound of children's laughter echoing off the walls of our rebuilt school. Those American soldiers gave us more than temporary comfort. They gave us a vision of what the world could become if people chose kindness over fear, understanding over hatred, hope over despair. The war had taught us that human beings were capable of terrible destruction, but those soldiers taught us an equally important truth, that we were also capable of extraordinary kindness, even toward those we had been taught to consider enemies. In choosing to see Japanese children as simply children who deserved toys and chocolate, they helped create the foundation for a friendship between nations that has lasted for generations. Their gift was not just chocolate and toys, it was the demonstration that peace was more than just the absence of war. True peace, they showed us, was the presence of understanding, the willingness to kneel down to a child's level and offer something sweet, the courage to build schools instead of just winning battles. Epilogue. In the end, the greatest victory was not military but human. The discovery that former enemies could become lifelong friends, that children's laughter could heal wounds that politics had torn open, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon was a piece of chocolate offered with a gentle smile. Those American soldiers proved that true strength lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the choice to create something beautiful from the ashes of what had been broken. The memory of their kindness became the foundation upon which two nations built a friendship that has endured through decades of change, challenge, and growth, a living testament to the truth that human compassion knows no boundaries and that the sweetest victories are those that leave everyone stronger than they were before.